This is the story of Suriname Airways Flight 764. On the 7th of June 1989, an American DC-8 owned by Suriname Airways was to fly from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport to Suriname. Flight 764 departed Amsterdam at 11:35 p.m. and they expected to get to Suriname at about 4:30 a.m. local time, give or take a few minutes. The flight there was not an issue. Everything went as it should. The weather cooperated and the passengers on board had a generally good time. But all that was about to change. 20 minutes before they got to Paramaribo, Suriname, the pilots got a routine weather report. Now, the winds were calm, but the visibility left a lot to be desired. They only had about 900 meters or about 3,000 feet of visibility. Not the best when you're landing at night, and they needed to carry out a VOR/DME approach to the airport. For the uninitiated, that's a comparatively hard approach to a runway where you have to use beacons to line yourself up with the runway. Now, the thing to note here is that there's a higher margin of error and a DME approach compared to something like an ILS approach, which is relatively precise. Today, though, the pilots would be landing on runway 10. But in the cockpit, things were starting to get tense as the captain was expecting better conditions at the airport. He asked his first officer, what happened with the 6 kilometers of visibility? The pilots then talked about the minima or the minimums for this approach. Basically, if the weather got too bad, then they'd have to discontinue this approach and then either A, wait around the airport until the weather got better, or B, go to another airport nearby that had better weather. The thing is, the airport at Paramaribo had an ILS approach that would be super useful in the situation, but it was out of order. At this time, in the cockpit, the pilots were peering out in the darkness, trying to pierce through the fog. They could see a town off in the distance. Maybe the fog wasn't as bad as they thought. They then saw the airport. The first officer said, "You can see the airport down there, no problem. That's right here. Visibility won't be a problem." I imagine that he probably sounded a bit relieved to see the airport so clearly. Maybe this landing wouldn't be as challenging as they thought it would be. They then decided to make a pass over the airport and then land. At 9:48 p.m., the pilots got the all clear to perform the DME/VOR approach to Paramaribo. In the darkness over Suriname, the pilots worked to intercept the right radial VOR that would lead the massive jets towards the airport. At this point, they were 9 DME away from the airport, and the pilots agreed to turn when they hit 7 DME. The first officer was coaching the captain on how to fly. He said, "It's a level out. It's about 10 degrees to the right. Level out now and you should be fine." But there was some confusion in the cockpit. They really didn't have a good idea on how far out they were from the airport. But then the airport came into view and the first officer said, "Runway is at 12 o'clock. Right next to the runway was a fog bank that they had been warned about. With them having a tentative visual on the runway, the captain asked the airport authorities to crank up the brightness on the runway lights to the max. But still, they lost visual on the runway due to the fog. In the cockpit, at this point, the ground proximity warning system's alarms started to go off. This plane was too close to the ground. Still, the pilots stayed on the approach. The first officer then called 200 feet, but the plane kept on descending. The plane was not supposed to be this low, and they were in grave danger. But strangely, no one made any attempt to get the plane out of the danger that it was in. Then the sounds of the plane striking the trees was recorded, and then silence. Flight 764 had crashed short of the runway at Paramaribo. Of the 187 people on board, only 11 people survived. As with most investigations, the investigators for the crash of Flight 764 relied on the flight data recorder to get a clear idea of what happened in the last few moments of the flight. That data is super important, but in this case, most of the important part of that data, the altitude information in particular, was not recorded by the FDR, which was a massive blow to the investigators. So the investigators had to get creative to get a rough idea of what the plane was doing in its final moments. They used the elevation of the airport and the altitude callouts that was made in the cockpit to make a generalized estimate in terms of the plane's altitude. This proved to be a massive puzzle piece in solving what happened to Flight 764. They found out that the plane was consistently below the correct glide slope down to the runway. They then turned their attention to the CVR, and that's when they heard something absolutely shocking. Here's a quote, "We have to use it." End quote. They were talking about the ILS for the airport. If you remember correctly, the ILS was out of order. There was a NOTAM that was out at that point telling the pilots that the ILS was out of commission. The NOTAM basically told the pilots that the ILS was not precise enough to be used. But shockingly, these pilots decided to use this faulty ILS to get this plane on the ground. They knew what they were doing was wrong, because in the cockpit they said, "We don't legally have an ILS, but we have to use it." That's just crazy. They knew what they were doing was very, very illegal, but they went for it anyway. Then, when they went through the approach, problems started to crop up, because of course it did. The ILS was not meant to be used. They struggled to get on the glide slope, but they were able to get on the localizer, which meant that they would be lined up with the runway, but they would not have any sort of vertical guidance whatsoever. But here's the thing. As all of this happened, the plane slipped further and further below the correct glide slope that they should be on. Moreover, it's not like the pilots did not know that they weren't on the correct glide slope. They got multiple glide slope warnings, but the pilots just chose to ignore all of them. I mean, why would you ignore glide slope warnings on an approach where you're using an unauthorized ILS signal to land? If anything, in this case, you should be more wary of alarms, not less. The investigators think that someone in the cockpit physically silenced the alarms. I mean, that is almost unthinkable. They silenced the one warning that could have saved them. They then did something unbelievably stupid. I'm so sorry, there's no other way to put this. They went below the minimum altitude. Just to recap, they had bad weather, they were on an unauthorized ILS approach, and they were getting glide slope warnings every few seconds. And then they decided to go below the minimum altitude that they should not go below unless everything was absolutely perfect. That was not the case with Flight 764. Everything was not picture perfect, and they should not have gone below the minimum altitude. The thing is, if the pilots had actually flown the approach that the ATC had given them, then they would have been about 600 feet higher than they actually were. There was no reason that they had to do this, and that's what makes all of this so sad. To drive home how bad this approach was, when the plane gave the pilots the glide slope warning, the first officer thought that they were above the glide slope and not below it. Maybe that's why they didn't do anything about the warnings that they got and silenced the warning. So with all of this, the investigators decided to dig into the pilots and their history. And boy, did they find some stuff. The captain was unqualified to fly the DC-8 in this capacity. Long story short, he was not supposed to be a captain. Here's what they found. When these pilots were recruited by SLM from an American company called ACI, or Aircrew International, SLM thought that these pilots were qualified to fly the DC-8, but their backgrounds were not looked into by SLM. Here's the thing, the pilots themselves were required to get the necessary flight checks, and this captain had not gotten some of his checks. Also, the captain did have a license for the DC-8, but at the time of the accident, he was 66. Now, this was an international commercial flight, and as per regulation, someone who is above the age of 60 cannot be in control of an international commercial flight. Even if he were under the age of 60, he still would not be able to fly this plane, as he and the other pilots had not undergone a multitude of proficiency checks that were required to be able to legally fly a DC-8. Digging into this guy's history just brought up more and more red flags. For example, he was once written up for ramping up his engines at Miami to full RPM near terminal buildings, despite rules saying that he could not do that. When he was reprimanded by the airport officials for that little stunt, he just didn't care. In another instance at Belém Airport, the plane left the runway and got stuck in mud when he turned too sharply. Then at Lisbon Airport, he landed so hard that the tires deflated and the runway got damaged. It got so bad that ACI, or Aircrew International, the company that SLM hired the captain from, had directives in place to prevent the assigning of the captain to SLM by the orders of the executives at the company. But despite this, logs showed that he kept flying for the company. Oh, and it gets worse because someone at SLM's logistics department noticed this and reported it to the operations department, and yet nothing was done. Man, Going into this video, I thought that this would be another one of those videos where a well-meaning pilot did the wrong thing in the heat of the moment, but that's not the case here. This is pure negligence and borderline criminal. At any point in this chain, someone could be like, hey, this guy should not be flying a plane. Someone please get him off of the flight deck. But no. Had that happened, then Suriname Airways Flight 764 would not have crashed. It's sad, but a few pilots made a few dumb decisions and hundreds of people paid the price. Who do you think is responsible for this crash, though? The pilots who made the dumb decisions or the people who put them on the flight deck so that they could make the dumb decisions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.